The House will now proceed to the consideration of a motion to adjourn the House for the purpose of discussing a specific and important matter requiring urgent consideration, namely global warming.
Accordingly, the motion is as follows. Mr. Erskine-Smith, seconded by Ms. de Bruzen, moves that this House do now adjourn.
Debate. The honourable member for Beaches East York.
Thanks very much, Madam Speaker. We have a choice as elected officials, Madam Speaker. When confronted with a difficult and complicated issue like climate change, we can lead or we can follow. We can take evidence seriously and communicate the need for action to our communities. We can work to change minds in pursuit of the public good. We can spend our energy building the necessary political will to do what is right. Or we can do what is easy. We can dismiss experts, embrace populism, and attack evidence-based solutions without offering any alternative of our own. We can do what is easy for electoral gain, or we can fulfill our responsibilities as trustees in the public interest, and we can do what is difficult because it is right. Now, I'm going to quote an American, Madam Speaker. On September 12, 1962, President John F. Kennedy said the following about going to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. The same leadership is required now. We require that same willingness to spend significant time and resources to accomplish great things. In contrast, here's what we heard from the current president on 60 Minutes this weekend. I think something's happening. Something's changing, and it'll change back again. I don't know it's a hoax. I don't think it's a hoax. I think there's probably a difference, but I don't know that it's man-made. I will say this, I don't want to give trillions and trillions of dollars. I don't want to lose millions and millions of jobs. I don't want to be put at a disadvantage. I'm not denying climate change, but it could very well go back. You know, we're talking about over millions of years. He went on to question the consensus among scientists that we should be concerned with human-caused global warming, stating that scientists have a very big political agenda. This is a failure of leadership. And I highlight the lack of American leadership today because Americans have historically helped to lead our world in so many important ways. And if we do not have committed American leadership, if we do not have America helping Canada to lead the world on this issue, on climate change and tackling climate change, we face serious challenges in confronting this. Of course, we face similar challenges of leadership here in Canada, too. Conservative Premier Doug Ford has recently said that he has heard from people across Ontario and from out west, and he wants the Prime Minister's hands out of their pockets. This is a failure of leadership, and frankly, it's willful blindness towards the evidence. Any Conservative MPP who supports this attack on evidence-based decision-making on the most important issue of the day should be ashamed of themselves. Now, we have a failure of leadership in this House, too. When we talk about climate change, the importance of climate change, the fact that we have the Nobel Prize winner in economics, William Nordhaus, win it for his support of carbon pricing, of putting a price on pollution. And we have the Conservative opposition, not to a person, because there is some leadership on this side, but almost to a person, say, the carbon tax is a tax grab, the price on pollution is a tax grab. And yet, Madam Speaker, when I go into schools, and I was in 6 schools this past week, elementary schools and high schools in the area, and I thank the students of Beaumont, of George Webster, of East York, of Malvern, and of Neil McNeil. When I talk to them and I ask them, should we make sure that those who are causing damage to our environment, should they have to pay for that damage that they cause? And everyone says, well, obviously they should. When I ask if someone is profiting from an activity and imposing the cost of that activity on the rest of us, should the person who's profiting be the one who pays? And they say, of course, of course. And it's not just the kids who say this. Every economist, every climate scientist, everyone who has studied this issue, they all say the same thing. We need to make sure that the negative externality of polluting, we We need to address that. We need to make sure that the cost of polluting is paid for by the polluter. We need to make sure that a price is put on this to address the market failure. And yes, a carbon price, a price on pollution, this is the conservative way to address climate change. It is the most fiscally responsible way to address climate change. It is the market mechanism through which we can most effectively address climate change. But don't take it from me, and don't take it from the kids at Bowmore. Take it from the 2018 winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics and his lifetime of work. I don't want to spend my time tonight just talking about one particular solution, because frankly, when I read that IPCC report and the importance of getting to 1.5 degrees, when I read that report, my takeaway is we need to talk about the problem. I think the problem's obvious. The kids in those classrooms think the problem is obvious, but not enough Canadians clearly think that the problem is obvious. Certainly not enough people in this House think that the problem is obvious. And we need to change that. When I see chairs of the IPCC working groups say, this is a problem of political will, that we know that the science is there, we know that we can actually do, we know that we can go to the moon, as it were, except, of course, the difference, I referenced John F. Kennedy, but the difference is going to the moon was a choice. We have no choice to tackle climate change, and that's so clear in this recent report from the IPCC and thousands of scientists around the world. But we need to talk about the problem more, because when we have individuals in this House who say, oh, no, your solution is no good, and they offer no solution at all, they clearly don't understand the significance, the importance, and the nature of the problem. So we need to talk about the problem, and we need to spend our efforts, and I think fundamentally I can't think of a more important issue to spend our efforts addressing. We need to spend our efforts building the necessary political will. We need to show leadership. We need to say, yes, this is a difficult problem, and we're going to spend our time as leaders of our communities and of our country educating Canadians who don't understand the problem and don't understand the potential solutions, and building the necessary political support for doing what is right. We have Deborah Roberts of the IPCC say, the next few years, not waiting until 2030, not waiting until 2045, not waiting decades into the future, the next few years may be the most important in human history. Because the decisions we make now as political leaders on the issue of climate change will affect generations to come. When I see Jim Skay, another co-chair of the IPCC working group, say, when I see him say, we know that the physics are there, we know that the chemistry is there, we know that the science is there, and the final tick box is political will. If anyone has kids in this House or grandkids in this House and cares about future generations, how is it that we can hear the clarion bell from scientists around the world, from many different countries? The consensus from the scientific community is loud and clear, and we can see the final tick box is political will, and we stand or sit in this House and we fail to take the necessary action to build that political will. Anyone who fails to take the steps necessary to build that political will isn't doing their job in this House. They're taking the easy way out. They hope, attacking the carbon tax, axing the carbon, axe the tax because it rhymes, I might win an election, and it's easy to sell. They should be ashamed of themselves. This is so important, not just to our generation, which the IPCC report tells us, that we're going to see major change. And there are huge differences between 1 degree, 1.5 degree, 2 degrees, or the disastrous 3 degrees that we're currently on pace for. Major differences. It's not an all or nothing approach. This idea that Canada plays such a small role, we're such a small number of emissions, that we're a high level of per capita emissions, but we're a small percentage of the total pie. We shouldn't do anything, and we're not going to be successful in doing this anyway, so what's the point? Well, the future generations are the point. Every step we take to reduce a ton of emissions will matter. And we should do everything that we reasonably can do over the next few years, the most important in our history, to change this conversation, to frame this debate in the right way so that we can do what is right. It's so frustrating that at the end of the day, it comes down to political leadership, and there just isn't enough of it. We're in short supply. And so it's incredibly important that we're having this debate tonight, and that Canadians can see that some political leaders care. There's still a government that is willing to stand up and say climate change is real, and we're going to use the most efficient and effective method of tackling climate change, because that's not only what the climate scientists tell us, that's what every expert who has studied the issue tells us. And we're running out of time. That the IPCC report says, in a worst-case scenario, we face disastrous consequences if we continue on the pace that we're on by 2030, in 12 years. And I can tell you, seeing what I've seen, the lack of leadership from the other side, the attack on basic steps like putting a price on pollution that this government has tried to do from the other side. When I see that lack of political leadership, I think if we don't change the conversation now, we're going to wake up 2025, we're going to wake up 2028, we're going to be on the precipice of this disaster, and we're simply not going to have done enough. And have we done enough today? I think the answer is absolutely no. But over the last 3 years, and I'll say this, over the last 3 years, we have made significant strides towards tackling the most pressing issue of the day, not only for our country, but for our world. We've had leadership, and I've talked about a lack of political leadership, but we've had leadership in BC where they put a revenue-neutral price on pollution years and years ago. And all it takes is us seeing what works and making it a rule for the rest of the country. Making it a rule, if the Nobel Prize winner in economics had his way, making that a rule for our global community. We have, a quick rundown of some of the things that are reasons to be optimistic. A price on carbon, a price on pollution. Important investments in public transit and in green infrastructure and in clean energies. Stringent rules on methane. Phasing out coal. These are all important steps. And yet we're working with targets right now that are themselves insufficient for doing the job. And that's the fundamental point of this report, which is to say you, as political leaders, have to make sure that the target you are working towards is the right one. That we have to not just hope for 1.5 degrees, we have to work towards, with a concrete plan, 1.5 degrees if we want to stave off the worst of climate change. So what does that mean? What is it for us to do our part? For starters, the Paris Agreement, and yes, it's important that we enter into the Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement contemplates every 5 years a country has to revisit the nationally determined contribution. I would say in the wake of this report, in the wake of this, the largest clarion bell from the science community, that when scientists who are part of this report say, if there's any takeaway for people from this report, it's that this is an urgent issue to deal with. There's a sense of urgency. That is what I want political leaders to take away from this report. And so if we are acting on that sense of political urgency, we need to make sure that our targets are consistent with those 1.5 degrees, and tomorrow no one's snapping their fingers and saying we're fossil fuel free. It's an impossibility. But we need to make sure that we are on a trajectory to not only meet our current targets, but to meet the targets where we are doing our international, our intergenerational, and our moral part, doing our part in the world. That this idea that we can walk away from doing what is right for not only ourselves, but the global community and for future generations, we have to draw a line in the sand and say, enough is enough. That the science is there, and enough of the political games, enough of the political attacks on good ideas and experts. We stand with those who have studied the issue. We stand with scientists. We stand with the evidence. And we're going to act on the evidence in the best interests of our world. Now, what can we do beyond setting targets? And I think the report is an important document not only for stressing the urgency of the problem, but for setting a pathway towards solutions. And so we know that transportation is a major issue that needs to be dealt with, and this government has to introduce a zero-emission vehicle strategy that is on par with world leaders like California. This government has to tackle retrofits for buildings. And as provinces are walking away from providing incentives to homeowners and commercial landowners to retrofit their buildings and make sure that they are resilient, make sure that there's not energy leakage, we as a government, if provinces are going to walk away from their responsibility, we have to fill that void and be the political leaders in Canada and make sure that there are programs so that homeowners and commercial landowners are doing their part in changing and upgrading their buildings. We need to recognize that our own consumption habits make a huge difference. And no one's going to go vegan tomorrow because of the speech I give tonight. But I'll say this. When I look at the reports of the impact of our diets on climate change, over 20% of the total greenhouse gas emissions are caused by livestock and agriculture, and it's about 15% from livestock alone. And when I look at the numbers and I see someone with who consumes a plant-based diet imposes less than or someone who consumes 100 grams of meat a day on average makes a bigger impact, makes a 2.5 times impact on climate change than someone who consumes a plant-based diet. We all need to change our consumption habits if we care about future generations and doing our part in this world. Yes, it's mainly about governments, but it's also about citizens, and we're all in this together, and we need to act as if we're in this together. Scientists have been calling on political leaders to act for a very long time. In 1992, the Union of Concerned Scientists and more than 1,700 independent scientists, including the majority of living Nobel laureates, they wrote, "World Scientists' Warning to Humanity." And they wrote that a great change in our stewardship of the earth and the life on it is required if vast human misery is to be avoided. Fast forward to December of last year. Over 15,000 scientists from over 180 countries wrote a second warning to humanity. They wrote, "Since 1992, with the exception of stabilizing the stratospheric ozone layer, humanity has failed to make sufficient progress in generally solving these foreseen environmental challenges, and alarmingly, most of them are getting far worse. Especially troubling is the current trajectory of potentially catastrophic climate change due to rising greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels, deforestation, and agricultural production, particularly from farming ruminants for meat consumption. As most political leaders respond to pressure, scientists, media influencers, and lay citizens must insist that their governments take immediate action as a moral imperative to current and future generations of human and other life." And now this past week, we have another report from thousands of scientists saying, time is running out. We only have a runway of a few years to change course now so that we make those long-term planning decisions that by 2030, we're at a place where we're going to have a cleaner economy and we're going to be able to meet that 1.5 degree target. And I started with a quote from two quotes from American presidents, one good and one disastrous. And if the Americans are unwilling to lead on the world stage, then that has to be Canada's role. And we can't lead on the world stage unless we take action at home. And so I hope, if nothing else comes from this emergency debate, I hope for two things. One is that those following this at home will recognize we have to talk about the problem more. With our neighbors, with our communities, we have to recognize the scope and importance and urgency of this problem if our political leaders are going to act, because at the end of the day, from what I've seen in this House, people will follow if citizens demand it, and we need citizens to demand it. And we need citizens to ask for greater leadership from those in this House. And the second takeaway is we, those on this side, if we see a failure of leadership from the Conservative Party on this issue, and not all Conservatives, Mark Cameron, Preston Manning, I could run down a list of Conservatives who believe in market principles and pricing carbon, but this current Conservative leader doesn't believe in that evidence, and not enough people on that side are standing up to say we believe in evidence and we're going to stand with the evidence and we're going to stand with the scientists. So if we're going to see a failure of leadership on that side, we need to double down on this side and say, you know what? Doing the right thing is more important than doing what is politically expedient. And when thousands of scientists around the world are saying now is the time to act, here's the pathway for action, and if we don't act, there will be dire consequences, then it's up to us to be the political leaders, educate Canadians about the scope of the problem, the importance of the problem, the urgency of the problem, and the solutions to the problem, and make sure we act far faster and much more immediately than we currently are. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.